Manning here from Strong Data Sheets, and today I'm going to be going over what is probably the most important part of setting up a spreadsheet, and that is extracting the data and being able to visualize it so that we can make our programming decisions into the future. So that we've obviously seen this person go through this 4-week program. They filled out all of their data and it's spread across the weeks and sessions that they've completed. What I'm now going to show you is how we can use Google Sheets to pull all of this data into some tables and some graphs that we can more easily view. So if I come down underneath here, first I'm going to be looking at just the squat data. One of the things that I've got off to the side is that I like having the split here. And that just shows me where throughout the week those squat sessions were. I've also got information on daily readiness to train so that I can see how they're coming into each session, as well as how hard they rated each session. And on this part of the sheet, I've kind of got that over the week so I can see how that progressed. And then I've got my intensity metrics, the volume, as well as what the estimated 1RM was doing so that I can see how successful that block was. Now, in order to take the information from the squats here and throughout the block, what I come down to is this section in which at the click of a button, I'm able to load that information and it populates in these graphs and tables. So I've got that main primary squat session. I can see how it moved, as well as the intensity and volume which sat underneath it. That's obviously not the whole picture because I want that layered against the other squat sessions that I had. So I had a secondary high bar session, a tertiary or priming session where I had some tempo squats, and then in their accessory slot, because I think that that's still important to track, I had some belt squats. So I'm able to select that from these drop-down menus, and I have all of that information now. So I can see where the week that they were strongest was, how it changed over the block and how many kilos they were able to add, as well as looking through the percentages that they were working at, the RPEs, and how much total work that they were sort of doing. So what I'm now going to do is show you how the formulas in which you're able to pull from here and push that data into these tables and graphs. So I've just got a very simplified, in this case, one session. Now the first thing that I calculate are the estimated 1RM, tonnage, reps and percentage, and I have this hidden. So what this is you can highlight these, and inside view there's this thing called group, and it creates this button in which I can click it and unclick it, and we're able to see we're able to hide this information. And I like hiding that because I don't want my lifter to necessarily obsess over this estimated 1RM during their sessions. I want them focused on executing what I prescribed for them. So I have that hidden on a day-to-day basis, but when I'm looking at it, I can open it. So first thing that I'm going to do is take the percentage. So coming back to this data sheet, we've got this table which shows us the relationship between the reps, the RPE that they're doing, and what percentage of that 1 rep max is. This is not perfectly accurate to each lift and to each lifter, right? They're going to work at different percentages. What I mean by that is a set of 5 at 7 RPE will average out at 78.6%. However, that's not going to be true necessarily for something like their bench as opposed to their deadlift. And it's also not going to be true between lifters. So everybody's going to sit somewhere on a bell curve, and this is kind of the average. The way that I look at this, however, is that it's kind of like a cheap set of scales that you buy at Kmart. It's not as accurate as the calibrated scales that you use to weigh yourself in at comp day. However, if you're consistently using those cheap bathroom scales, you can see change. Even though you might jump on the scales and it says 80 kilos, you might be 81.5. But if you're standing on the scales and it's saying 80 kilos and 2 weeks before you were 83 kilos, you know that you have dropped those 3 kilos as an absolute number. So that looking at this estimated what we'll eventually get to is looking at estimated 1RM. As long as that number is changing, that is accurate. So without further ado, what we're going to use is a function called VLookUp. So the first thing that I want it to look at is what was the RPE that this person has completed. So in this case, it's a 7, but it sits in this G4 column. The next thing is that I want it to know where in this data sheet it's going to extract the percentage from. So we're going to come through here and we're going to select all of that information. Now, the next variable that we want to look at is the reps. So as the function at the moment, what it's doing is that it's looking down this column at the RPE, and in this case, it's finding the 7. It knows that it's somewhere in here. Now it needs to be told what column to look at based on the reps that they completed. So if we come back here, they did 3. So that it sits in this cell, right? So in this data sheet, it is going to be looking at the 3rd column, right? Because we've selected 3. The problem with that is that it's looking at the entirety of the part of the sheet that we've selected. So in this case, what it would actually do is that it would look at the 3rd column, which is actually 2 reps, not 3. So we're just going to add a +1. So +1. So now it's looking at the 4th column, which is where these 3 reps sit. We now need to put in false, and that's to basically tell this sheet that we're looking for an exact number rather than something else. And now if we come back here, it's pulling the percentage that corresponds to a set of 3 reps at 7 RPE. So it's been able to find 7 RPE and the 3 reps, and it's pulling out this number. Okay, so now we have the percentage that this set was. I'm now going to basically pull this down so that it applies to all of these. The problem with that is we'll see this error code. Now what that comes down to is that what copying this formula down this column does is that it takes the relative position of each cell. So that we'll see this one underneath, it's now taking G5, D5, which is what we want because we're now looking at these, but it also does the same to this part of this sheet. So it's actually moved it down 1. So in order to fix that, what we actually do is we come through here and we place the $sign. And what that does is it locks it so that when we copy and paste it, we know that it is always going to look at this range rather than something else. So now when I pull this down, it's always going to go from that range, but it does update the fact that this cell is now looking at the row 6 rather than the row 4 where we took it from. Okay, so that's just the kind of basics of how how Google Sheets work and how you're able to copy and paste formulas. So now we've got those absolute values. We can see that we now have the percentage that lifter was working at for all of the sets that they completed. Okay, now in order to evaluate estimated 1RM, so we know that 100 kilos is 83.7% of their estimated 1RM. So in order to find the actual estimated 1RM, it is simply this divided by that percentage. Okay, and we can copy that down. So for this top set, they had an estimated 1RM of 119.5 kilos. Okay. The next thing that I calculated is tonnage. Tonnage is probably something that people have moved away from looking at. I think that most coaches are more likely to look at the total number of reps that a person was looking at, completed, and the number of sets. But it's simple enough to calculate, and I don't think it's a bad thing to look at. So it would be the load times the reps times the sets. And we can also drag that down as well. And I also want to look at the total number of reps. So we're going to look at 1. This wouldn't be a problem if you were to basically have each row as its own set. However, in this case, what I generally do is, so I've kind of got these 2 top sets. So I've got a top set of 3 and a top set of 5. And then I've got these really sub-maximal back-offs. And I don't create a separate line for each of these. I just ask my lifter to put the RPE of that last set that they did. And so that they're all just combined together and it's a little bit neater. So we now, in this case, they did 15 reps in this row across those 3 sets. Okay. So we've now kind of got all of the information that we need here. Now what we need to do is be able to, on demand, pull whichever part of this day down into the tables that we're going to construct here. So the first thing that we're going to do is something called data validation. So we go into here, data validation, and we're going to add a rule. So in this cell, I only want the lifts in here. So drop down menu from range. The range is where we're going to have these lifts. Okay, and now that's finished. So at the moment it's got nothing in it, but we are now able to pull the bench, the squat, or the deadlift. Okay, so now with that, and we know what we're trying to search for, or the sheet now knows what it's trying to search for. Estimated 1RM is the first thing that I look at. It is simply what we're benchmarking progress against. So that's kind of the first thing that I want to look at. We're going to use a function called filter. So what I want it to do is I want it to filter the estimated 1RM, and I want it to do so where this cell matches somewhere in here. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go equals this equals somewhere in this range. Okay, so now this cell, what it has done, it has searched in this cell and it knows that squats, right? So it looks in here and it finds these are the 3 rows where squats sit, and then it goes over to this column and pulls these 3 values. One thing to note is that you've got to be careful with how many rows that you want to look at. So that if, in this case, it's set up for just 3, and I'm going to put some data underneath here. So you've got to be careful with that, because if you're going to have 5 rows and you've got a cell which is populated in the 4th row, it won't actually populate. So that in this case, keeping it more simple, I'm just going to have 3 rows, but in my actual sheet, I have 6 or 5. I think that's probably more than enough to get in maybe some ascending sets and some back-offs, or maybe a couple of top sets and back-offs or whatever, but I limit it to 5 in here. But that's a complete side note, but it is something that you want to think about beforehand. Okay. Intensity. So I want to look at percentage as the first thing. Well, okay, before I go on to that, when looking at percentage, looking at these terms that we've got of intensity and volume, they're realistically kind of these nebulous concepts. There's not a number which describes it perfectly. in some ways, each of the numbers that we're going to look at are kind of lenses through which we can look at intensity. So one of them is obviously percentage, absolute load on the bar. However, you can have a low percentage. You can work somebody in like the 70% range, but if it's a set of like a high number of reps, they're also going to be working close to failure, and so it's going to be a high RPE. So it might be a low relative intensity, it might be a low absolute intensity, but a high RPE and therefore a high absolute intensity. So that I split these metrics up under this heading of intensity to remind myself that there's kind of these three, I'll fill it out to be these three lenses through which I look at intensity. Anyway, side note, it actually sits here. And so now we're going to use the same filter function to basically pull these out. Okay, so the first thing that I should have done is make sure that this B15 sits as an absolute number. And it is actually A15. And then also, where I'm pulling it from, we also want this to be absolute as well. So we will put those dollar signs in again. And the range which we're pulling it from is here. Okay, so now we've got our percentage. The next that I want to look at is RPE. So now that everything is locked like that, I only need to tell it which range to look at. Now the next is number of reps per set. And you might think, well, that's surely a volume metric, not an intensity metric. If we look at this data sheet, what this is actually showing us is the relationship between these three variables is if I was to do, a single at 100%, it is 10 RPE. But another way of looking at that is if I take 100%, I know that it's going to be 10 RPE and I can only do one rep. Maybe a simpler way of looking at it is that if I was to give somebody an AMRAP of, let's say, 85%, right? So that it is a 10 RPE. If I'm to come across to the 85% mark, I know that they're going to get between 5 and 6 reps, right? So this reps variable is actually a product of intensity rather than being a part of volume. It feeds into volume, but looking at it here, when we think about like rep range sensitivity, which is something that I definitely do want to track, I want to find which rep ranges a person responds to, it's actually clustered in this intensity concept that we're looking at. Set. Okay. The next that I want to look at is our volume. We'll start with tonnage. Coming down this column, enter. Tonnage, I'll do number of sets. And then the last one is I'm going to call it cumulative reps. So this would be tonnage is obviously the amount of reps that you're doing plus the weight. So that theoretically, on something like bicep curls, if you were to do 5 sets of 15, even though you're only using 10 kilos, you're actually going to rack up a lot of tonnage. But what's probably more important is just kind of the number of reps that you were doing. So that's where this way of looking at volume kind of falls in. Nope. And again, we're just going to come from total reps. Okay. Right, so we've now got this set up. I now want to look at the totals and the averages. So in this case, all of these metrics are going to be averages, and all of these are going to be totals. So this is as simple as sum, but not that range. I want it to be this range. Okay. And then sliding that across. From there, the average reps per set, I'm not actually going to calculate from here. There's an easier way of doing that, which is simply the total number of reps divided by the number of sets. Now, going back to what I was speaking about before, if we're trying to look at, a person's rep range sensitivity, I can now see that this 4.6 number means that if this was a successful block of squats, that they should mostly be squatting in this 4 to 5 range for reps per set. The average RPE. Now, you might simply go you might assume that I would just take this number. The problem with that is, again, it kind of comes down to the fact that I've added 3 sets in this row rather than 1. So that even though they did 2 sets at a 7 RPE, they've actually done 3 at 5, and that's going to drag it down. We need to actually weight these sets of 5 by 3 as opposed to sets at 5 by 3 rather than just single. So in order to do that, we just kind of do it manually. So equals, so it would be this times 1, so we're only doing it once, plus this times 1 plus this times 3. And then all of this is then going to be divided by the total number of sets that they've done. So I think that number, which it was reporting, was like 6.3. As we'll see, it now comes down a little bit to account for the fact that they did 3 sets at this 5 RPE. And now I will switch off for a second whilst I do this one, because I'm sure you don't want to be bored by that. Okay, and now we've also got this number. Okay. Estimated 1RM. I've left this one to last because it's kind of the trickiest. Now, you might think, well, do I want an average? No, you don't. The reason that being is that, particularly when you start doing higher rep sets, what tends to then happen is that on this sheet, the closer that you are to 100%, the more accurate it is. So those kind of top sets are going to give you a far better indication of where your max is, because it's closer to your max, right? So that I don't want, these sets of 5. So, well, in this case, we would only have the sets of 5 to look at, but I would much prefer to look at this triple than I would these sets of 5. The other thing is that looking at these back-offs, what we can kind of see is that the estimated 1RM is dropping off. And that's as they're fatiguing through the session, right? Your first couple of sets are going to be, where you've got the most energy, and we're slowly losing some of that performance. But we want this top set to be the best indication. So you might say, well, why don't I just pull out the top set. I also call this the indicator set, because that is where I'm benchmarking all of my progress on. Okay, cool. Problem with that is that we don't necessarily always just program a top set. In this bench, we will see that we've actually got a fatigue single. And this single is the highest percentage, 87% as opposed to 83%. And so it's pulling this number, which isn't our best indication of where they're at. So what we need to do is we need to find a way in which the sheet can find the highest percentage and report that estimated 1RM rather than anything else. So to do that, we're going to again use VLookUp. Now, the first thing is that I want it to determine a max. So I want it to determine a max within here. From there, what we're now going to do is we're going to give it these kind of two columns to look at. So when you find the max in here, I want you to go across to this column. So, and just the way that the formula is laid out, we use a squiggly bracket this range, comma, no, it is a comma, then this range. The next thing that we're wanting to tell it to do is we're telling it to look at the second column. So we're telling it to report the second column. So in this case, the second column is this B15 17, which is the estimated 1RM that we're trying to pull out. So we put a 2 there as the second column. Similar to the false that we had to use in this VLOOKUP, again, it's looking for an exact number, but the way that this formula is laid out, we need to put a 0. Now we close things off, and it's pulling off this 71 number as their estimated 1RM, and we can show that we put squats in, it's pulling out this top set, and if it is deadlifts, it's pulling out the last in these ascending sets, because that's the highest percentage. Okay, so these are now the numbers that I can look at, and they show me, what I need to know. But of course, it's not the whole picture. And this is where what the intention of this video is to do is to give you the tools to make your own spreadsheet. I don't want you to just take mine and run with it. And that's not just because I've spent a lot of time making it, but because the way that I've set up my spreadsheet reflects how I think about training. You might think that looking at volume and intensity this way is not something that you're going to find particularly useful. And so that I want you to have the tools to be able to figure out your own way of looking at this information. So that the steps that I went through are that now I've got this one lift, but obviously, right, they're not just, well, it's going to be very unlikely that I'm going to find a person who's just going to squat once. So that from there, what I've then done is taken this table, put in another table underneath it, and then I would put, the high bar, or I would put the secondary. So it might be high volume or high bar or whatever as the secondary. So now I've got another table that sits underneath it. And then I might have a tertiary squat and then an accessory. And then far at the bottom, then I've got another table which takes information from each of these subtables and then combines it to take this overall picture of the squat, right? That's how mine has been constructed. You will also obviously notice that this is 1 day of 1 week. You're not going to have that. You're going to need to create these tables, however you want to lay them out, underneath each week, or however you want to do it. So that's kind of, I hope that gives you the tools to make what it is that you want to design. The final thing that I'll end on is that how you construct your tables and graphs and where you analyze the data really reflects your programming style. So that for me, what you'll notice is that what I'm realistically looking at is in-block performance. So the system that I use is pretty much the mainstream of powerlifting these days, which is having a vertically integrated system so that I don't have like hypertrophy strength peaking phases. I don't do block periodization. Everything is combined in one block. And so that for me, this is more than what I need. I just need to look at the variables in one block. That being said, that doesn't necessarily apply to everybody. For example, some of my bigger lifters, I notice that I have fallen into a pattern of a higher volume block where I don't necessarily see a lot of progression. And then I drop the volume and I see that strength expressed so that it is more of a block periodized style. And it kind of needs to be that way because the stimulus that I need to give them to get them stronger also suppresses their ability to express that strength. And so that whilst I still use this spreadsheet for them, what I would build out in the future is something that doesn't just look at the data within the block, but actually looks at data block to block. And so that I can see those longer term manipulations of volume and intensity. So that you'll see with different coaches, depending on their style of programming, that's going to be reflected in how they design a spreadsheet to look at data. And so you need to ask yourself, what system you use, and so how it would be best to display your data. So that, as I've spoken about, all of my data analytics is straight under a person's block. But if you're, I suppose, more somebody who does a bit more periodization, what you would need to do is create, having each block as its own tab, then creating a separate tab that pulls data from those other tabs so that you can see the volume and intensity over time. And the final thing that I kind of want to end on is, I suppose, why I've done all of this. You might look at all of these metrics and think that they're kind of over the top, and what can I kind of really look at within all of this? And that's true. And if I'm completely honest, I don't look at this too closely. Within my programming style, if I can see that this is working and I can see that estimated 1RM is going where I want it to go, I would then simply create a new block, look at, I suppose, how I laid out the week and the rough kind of volume and intensity that I used, and then create another block which is similar, right? So that I know that if I'm creating two blocks that are quite similar, all of these metrics are going to be roughly the same anyway. What it does for me, what it does allow me to do is that as I'm going through that process of kind of just, making little tweaks here and there, if I find that something stops working, I can go back through the blocks, take a deeper look at these metrics, and then decide, I've noticed that I really accidentally really dropped off tonnage, and that's what seems to be causing us to get a different result now. So that's kind of something to look at, is that I'm not, if I'm honest, obsessed with this stuff. It's just a fail-safe that I have. And so you as a coach might think that this is totally overkill, and that it might be just all too kind of overwhelming. And I'm not actually trying to sit here and say that, well, unless you have all of this data, that there's something wrong with your coaching style. I don't believe that at all. In fact, the better the coach, the less, well, I'll say the more experienced the coach, the less likely they are to actually kind of look at this stuff too much. The more experienced you are, you've kind of just got this intuitive sense of the data. So that Steve Denovi, for example, doesn't even track estimated 1RM. It's just something that he has this built-up knowledge of his lifters, and has that intimate knowledge that he knows where their training is going without needing to do that. And you might be a coach where like a lot of this stuff is quite redundant. For me, I like the fact that I can sit back at the end of a block, deliver a block review, and take my Loom video and tell them in front of all of this information, and kind of assess how everything went. And I don't think that there's necessarily anything wrong with that type of showmanship. I think that somebody is buying this product off me, of my coaching, and displaying this information in this way obviously conveys that, I'm doing my best as a coach to have my shit together, to look into these things in these fine detail. And so when I send a person a Loom with this in the background, it does create that wow factor that adds to that person's buy-in of my coaching. And so, I will admit that this is kind of overkill, and a lot of this was me going down the rabbit hole of, experimenting with all of these different functions in Google Sheets, and trying to really flesh it out. But I don't think that there's necessarily anything wrong with that. I think that having these hard numbers of, how much do we gain, how much should we gain per week, is useful information to have, that even if I don't look at it that often, it's always there as a fail-safe for me to look back upon. So I hope this video, probably being the most dense that I've put through, at least gives you the tools to start extracting data from a person's programming sheets, and then I want this to be kind of something that stimulates you to think about how you want to display that information. So thank you. If you've got any questions, please pop them in the comment section. Thank you. Thank you for getting this far.